The anxiety, fear and exhilaration of crossing the Red Sea is now behind them. They were promised a land of milk and honey, but on the other side of the Red Sea there is neither milk nor honey. There is just wilderness, empty wilderness. The Israelites walked for 3 days without finding any fresh water, and in the desert without water you're as good as dead, and of course the Israelites know this. They then stumble upon an oasis. There's hope. However, the deeply needed water at that oasis is undrinkable. Hopes are dashed, so the Israelites name the place bitter. God then points Moses to a piece of wood, probably the bark of a tree, and Moses throws the wood into the water, and the water becomes drinkable. God's first action with the Israelites in the wilderness is to reverse the first plague. The first plague was to make good water bad. The first action in the desert is to make bad water good. It indicates something is about to begin. So this may not be the land of milk and honey, but God is here, and God is listening, and God still sees, and God still acts. It turns out that the work God wants to do with the Israelites cannot be done, important to hear, cannot be done in a land of milk and honey. It requires the wilderness. The wilderness is not a mistake. So before moving on from the place of bitterness, God establishes the heart of what this new relationship will be with the Israelites, a relationship that now forms beyond slavery. They are free, but they are not free without purpose. True freedom in any part of life, true freedom is never just freedom from something. It is always freedom for something. Many of you will know the famous words of Viktor Frankl, who said, "Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how." Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. In other words, if we have a purpose for life, we can cope with almost any circumstance. And God is teaching the Israelites their why. Israel is now freed from slavery, and their why, in these verses at the end of chapter 15, their why in a nutshell is to live a life of God-centered worship. I really want us to understand this. We'll visit worship again down the track, but this is why they are free. This is their purpose, to live a life of God-centered worship. And so they are exchanging obedience to a cruel Pharaoh for obedience nevertheless, but this time to a loving God. So they set off, and the next stop they come across is another oasis, this one called Elim, which means palm trees. Fortuitously, there are 12 springs at this oasis, one for each tribe of Israel, the point being that there is enough water for everyone. Now, about a month after crossing the Red Sea, the Israelites are deep into the wilderness, and they are not happy. They do what all of us do at one time or another, is they have selective memory. They remember that in Egypt, that despite being slaves, they at least had a regular meal and water. But in the wilderness, nothing is guaranteed. Everything feels risky, uncertain. Some people say it takes selective memory to keep the human race going, because otherwise no one would have a second child. And now the Israelites, in their selective memory and in their anger, see the world through this distorted lens. They decide it was better to have been slaves in Egypt. Suddenly Pharaoh is something of a hero, and Moses is the enemy. We're not unfamiliar with this dynamic in our own country. We've heard the same lament. We hear people say we were better off under apartheid. It's a tragic thing to hear. And God hears these cries of his people. This time his promise is the reversal of the seventh plague. The seventh plague was the violent, destructive hailstorm. But now, instead of raining down destruction, God promises to rain down food, nourishment, sustenance, blessing. There'll be meat in the evening, and there'll be bread in the morning. Evening and morning sounds just like the creation story in Genesis. And so that evening, vast flocks of quail come flying into their camp. It's a bit like Kentucky flying chicken, I suppose. The next morning, a mysterious substance was found lying on the ground, and the people asked, "What is it?" And the Hebrew for "what is it" is manhu, from which we get the word manna. Therefore, the word manna is really, certainly written in this context, it's really a liturgical question. You can hear a congregation asking, "What is it?" And the leader responds, "It is the bread of the Lord." And so the food wonderfully is named as a question, so that whenever it is eaten, it begs a question and it requires an answer. What is it? And every time we eat, the answer is, the Lord has given it to you. The Lord has given it to you. It's a gift. It's a sacrament. This is not only food, it is a reminder that God is present and that God is faithful and that God saves. Wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if we remembered that at every meal we ate in our everyday lives, that God is present, that God is faithful, and that God saves. The author Eugene Peterson, through his writing, taught me the Latin phrase caveat lector. It means, it's Latin, let the reader beware. It's a warning that comes in certain sections to say the reader ought to now pay careful attention to the contents of what they are reading, and they need to decide as they read whatever it is they might be reading, whether this is accurate and reliable. Caveat lector. Is this accurate? Is it reliable? And I'm sure, certainly it's the impact it has on me, I'm sure that our reading for today deserves such a warning. Caveat lector. What I mean is this. We need to carefully decide whether the story, which is our reading for today, we need to decide whether it is reliable. It can easily remain being just a story, and if you like, even you can make it into a history. But should we decide that this story is reliable, and that it is true, and when I say true, I'm not arguing for it being historically accurate. I'm not saying it isn't, but I'm not arguing for truth in that sense. What I mean is that is it true for us in the sense that we discern that this story imparts God's truth. If we believe that the story is reliable and true, then caveat lector, reader beware. Because the instructions that God gives with the manna, I think, are unnerving for our modern world. I find them deeply unnerving for my own life and the way I think about the world. I feel the need for caveat lector, let the reader beware. Let's look at a few of those sentences and then we'll be done. In verse 18 of chapter 16, the manna has been given, and when they measured it out, everyone had just enough. Just enough. Each family had just what it needed. That word enough is a huge word. It's a huge word. It's not that everyone had a little bit of something, to quote Winnie the Pooh. It is that everyone had enough. No one needed or wanted more. Every family had what they wanted and needed. No one in the community was in need. And this creation rhythm of food in the evening and food in the morning gives us the sense that God's intention here is to right what is wrong in the world. Because when God created the world, He created it so that everyone would have enough. That there was enough for everyone. And the truth of the matter is, even though our population has exploded compared to those ancient days, the truth is our world still has enough for everyone. I know it's about to sound like I've lost my way, but I've not. Stay with me. This past week there was a big hoo-ha in the Christian community about the tableau at the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games. Some well-intentioned Christian people who felt like they needed to defend the faith, immediately assumed that the tableau was a mockery of the Last Supper. And so they called it blasphemy. They called that tableau blasphemous. Their concern revealed three errors. The first was that image was not of the Last Supper. The Olympic Games are Greek games, and it reflected on some Greek writing. We need to be careful that not every scene with people behind a long table is a depiction of the Last Supper. So that was a first mistake. The second was that many people were offended that the tableau included gay and transgender people and other people that might be deemed to be outside of the framework of others. So outside people not like us, if you like. And what we so easily forget is that Jesus was criticized for the company he kept. He hung out with people who were not like us. And so it was troubling that the Christian community was found to be up in arms about what they thought might be the table of the Lord, having people at it that were not like us. But the biggest problem, those two aside, the biggest problem with the Christian protest was this. In the Christian community, and we do this a lot, by the way, in the Christian community, we often are upset by the wrong things. We do get upset, but I think we get upset about the wrong things. So even if, and they didn't, but even if the Olympic organizers had bizarrely included some camp version of Da Vinci's Last Supper, that would not be the real blasphemy of our age. I wouldn't like it, I wouldn't be glad for it, but that would not be the real blasphemy of our age. The real blasphemy is this, that we live in God's world. It's His world, a world that He has made, a world, by the way, that He continues to make, and a world that He made with the intention that there would be enough for everyone, and yet so many people go hungry. In a world made where there is enough for everyone, so many go hungry. That, friends, is the real blasphemy. In God's world, when God is king, everyone has enough. The second instruction given to the Israelites with this food that comes to them is that the manna is not to be stored. Verse 19, do not keep any of it until morning. Because manna, this food, was not given to create a surplus for anyone. There was just enough for everyone, not for surplus. And God organized it, we'll reference this a little in a moment, but God organized it that no one could have more than they needed, or could have more than anyone else, because the food would go off. So it was designed to make sure that you couldn't keep any of it until the next day. And therefore, the thing that we need to ask ourselves, speaking of blasphemy, we need to ask ourselves the question, or recognize that the second blasphemy that this passage reveals is like the first. It has to do with inequity, where some have much and others have nothing or little. Because a surplus always comes at a cost. For some people to have lots, to have much, means that others are losing out. A surplus usually comes at the expense of those, and I deliberately use the pun, those lower down the pyramid. I don't want to be unkind, but it's just a nice obvious example. The cell phone that I'm using to record our sermon today, the one that you probably have with you in your home today, was in all likelihood assembled by workers who earn a very low wage. And the companies who organize for those people to get as cheap a labor as they can, they are, at least in Apple's instance, they are trillion-dollar companies. Trillion, it's inconceivable money. And someone's got to pay to make that kind of money. And it's not the guys at the top. It's the cheaper labor at the bottom. And Israel knew this kind of economic policy too well. That's what they had lived with in Egypt. They knew what exploitation looked like. They saw it every day. They worked on the opulence, but they never got it themselves. And God, in the wilderness, right in the beginning, God wants to develop a new kind of culture, a new way of thinking, a new economy for the Israelites. And by the way, and this is not insignificant, this is why Jesus taught us to pray only for daily bread. He never taught us to pray for lots of bread, because the cost of lots of bread is too high. The human cost for lots of bread is just too high. The second blasphemy is inequity. Finally, the third observation about this food that gets given is that despite the warnings to not hoard, Israel couldn't resist the temptation. Someone's always going to go against the stream, hey? So we read, but some of them didn't listen and kept some of it until morning. But by then it was full of maggots and had a terrible smell. And I kind of get it. I do. I'm empathetic for this, because as slaves, everything, they'd lived a life of scarcity. There was never a sense of abundance for them. There was only ever abundance for others. And now, for the first time in their lives, there was an opportunity to take more than they needed. The food was there on the ground, and so they did. They took more than they needed. We have witnessed this very thing in our own country. And like the hoarded manna, we have smelt the stench of the greedy in South Africa, and we felt the consequences of the greed, the maggots in our own situation in our country, because of this very thing that happened in the wilderness. Walter Brueggemann makes the very helpful observation that the Israelites had become so accustomed to eating from Pharaoh's stingy hand, you were never sure how much you would get, and you perhaps never got abundantly, only just the bare minimum. And they become so accustomed to eating from his stingy hand that they missed from whose hand they now ate. They hadn't yet moved. The manna fell from the sky, but they hadn't understood who it was really from. They hadn't understood that instead of the stingy hand of Pharaoh, they were now feeding from the generous hand of God. And if we don't know whose bread we are eating, we will be tempted to store it. If we live in a world in which we think we're eating from Pharaoh's hand, we will want to hoard our food. If we understand that we're eating from God's hand, it often does provoke a generosity in our own hearts, a trust. Those who eat from the hand of God, the passage wants to teach us, are expected to trust in the faithful providence of God for each day. Those who eat from the hand of God are called to trust in the faithful providence of God for each day. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. There was just one exception to the hoarding rule. On a Friday, the Israelites were allowed to collect enough for 2 days. And the reason was that one day needed to be devoted to rest and recreation, because creation is important in the story, rest and recreation and worship. So this exception gets made because worship is the highest value for this community. It's the one day the rule, as it were, gets broken and the food doesn't go off, because worship is at the center of this community. Because in the end, whenever we are saved for a reason. We are saved with a purpose. And for the Israelites and for us, we are saved to be obedient to God, not to Pharaoh, but to be obedient to God. And in that obedience, we need to be obedient to ensure that all will have enough. I find this very challenging. We need to be obedient to ensure that all will have enough. We need to be obedient to ensure that no one is exploited. That has to do with how we employ people and all other kinds. It's very challenging. And we need to be obedient in our worship and in our trust of God, to learn to trust in His providence more and more. As you consider this passage, I say to you one last time, caveat lector. Let the reader beware, because if we find it reliable and true, it can turn our world upside down. God be with you. Amen.